Hey guys, many of you have been asking about a full endgame variant for the Cryo-Shock Telestomp Stormweaver. I've been working hard to pull this together, and with a number of updates, I've been able to take this build into the higher maps with plenty of room left to grow. With these changes, you'll do more damage, have more survivability, and most importantly, have plenty more lightning balls to telestomp all over your enemies' faces with. If you're starting out as a new character, I would highly recommend checking out the starter video and build plan in the description below. And as always guys, make sure to drop a follow to the channel if you want to see future content, and if you have any questions regarding the build, leave a comment on the video, or check me out on Twitch where I'm live 5 days a week. Let's get into it. Okay guys, let's start with the skill updates. So just before we get into them, I'm just going to show you I only have 3 support gems for all of my skills except 1 right now. So on my current build there is plenty of room to grow still, but in the build planner in the description below there will be all of the slots filled out for your pleasure. So let's start with Lightning Warp here. So this is mostly the same as before, but I have added considering casting here. The reason for this being, cast speed is not that important for Lightning Warp here. We can cast this fast enough so that we can teleport around without being hurt if there's enough stuff to teleport on anyway, and this just increases the damage of our Lightning Warp by 25% straight up. So this is really, really nice. And just on top of that, we've still got Soul Drain because this gives us mana regeneration when we kill an enemy with it, and Overcharge because this just supercharges our shocks, which later on with our Ascendancies will double dip. The duration does not bother us because it creates shock patches on the floor, and these constantly apply shock to the enemies. So we don't really get the negatives here. Moving on, there have been some pretty big changes to Comet here to try and make it a better single target destroyer as well as just being more focused. So to start with, we are still using Spell Echo, so we get 2 times the cast when we do cast it manually. And then I've added Unleash on this because we're not going to be generally spamming this that hard. I use this mostly to engage a fight or on bosses when they're frozen when you can pump out some damage. But if you use this to engage a fight, this will fire out 4, 5, 6 comets all at once in conjunction with Spell Echo, which makes it extremely good to engage. And it's because it hits so hard with cold damage, it pretty much instant freezes everything with the amount of freeze build-up we've got. And this ends up generating a lot of lightning balls for us, so you can then jump over your ice walls and go and just obliterate everything with lightning warp that's left. And then the final one, I have left Arcane Tempo in here because you just do want the cast speed. This makes manually casting Comet feel a lot better. The big problem with manually casting Comet is that it just feels really clunky to cast because of the long wind-up. So if you do get enough cast speed, and I'm rocking 1.47 second cast time without, and this is whilst in town, so when I go outside of town and start ramping up my cast speed bonuses, this goes down to about 1.3. Once you get to that sort of range, it starts to feel a bit nicer to use. If you can get this anywhere near as a 1.1, 1.2, then this will feel really quick and really good to use. Moving on, Eye of Winter. I have toyed around with this a lot. This is, in my opinion, even better than Comet for single target damage, generally speaking, because it doesn't have the wind-up time, and the amount of consistent DPS this can output on an enemy once it's frozen is just phenomenal. Plus, it gives us critical weakness, so that gives us an extra 10% additive damage on anything we hit it with, but particularly the amount of projectiles we're hitting here. So what I've rocked here right now is Cold Exposure, which makes it on a critical hit, we apply Cold Exposure for 8 seconds. Very nice, but it does reduce the skill's damage. We'll come back to this. Secondly, I have changed Pierce to Fork. This is stronger, especially when against groups. But I just find this is stronger if you do want to use this for clearance. If we're using this solely for single target, it is possible that I will change this at some point, but I need to test that out still. But for now, we have put Fork here, because this does reduce the damage by 50%. I might look to see if there's a damage increaser for single target here. Thirdly, we've got Super Critical in here. This just supercharges the critical bonus from this skill. I'm currently rocking a 25.73% critical hit chance bonus here, plus the 10% you would get from critical weakness, so that's 35.73. So it's not very high right now, but we can absolutely get this higher, and that this will make it do double the amount of extra critical damage bonus that it would have got before. We could also put the extra crit chance gem in here later on as well if we deem that the best place to go, but I haven't got to the slots to test it, but that's probably where I'll put it. So that would just increase your critical hit chance on it as well. Elemental Focus is where I've gone next. This does remove Elemental Ailment application here, but if we're just using this solely for single target damage, this just ramps up the damage of this skill. So I found this to be quite effective so far. Again, I might play around. This is the one skill I've still got some playing around to do with, but for single target, this does generate hundreds of thousands of DPS. You can output. I output 500,000 of DPS on a boss during a time it was frozen earlier. So it is possible to output some pretty decent damage with this skill. Moving on, Frostbolt. Some very slight changes here. We're using this, it's still got some pretty good damage, but we're using it more for utility still. So I've added blind here, because with the ability with wild shards to just fire all of these everywhere all the time, you're just going to blind everything around you. This helps you an awful lot against physical based enemies, because that just means they're going to miss you pretty much all the time. And then we've still got glaciation on, because this is just exceptionally good on this skill for building up freeze and freezing those enemies to generate the lightning balls, so you can then jump on them and destroy them with lightning warp. Next, we've got Frost Bomb. We've gone back to some of the old setups. We've got Spell Cascade off of Comet back onto Frost Bomb. This just gives us 3 bombs every time we cast it. We don't actually care about the damage of Frost Bomb too much here. We are using it for the exposure generation on the group side, on the AoE side of things. So this is extremely useful here. Second Wind has always been useful, and I think we had this before. This allows you to cast 2 of them with the cost of a longer cooldown, but this does mean you can cast 2 of them, which gives you a more consistent output of exposure with it. And we've obviously added Strip Away here for the extra exposure application here. 30% means you'll get an extra 30% multiplier on the exposure multipliers. So that's as you increase your exposure, detriment, especially through Ascendancies, this will just get stronger. Later on, we can go into more damage or utility here. I haven't figured out what those will be, but this is pretty good for Frost Bomb right now. And last but not least, Frost Wall. So we've put Ingenuity on Frost Wall here, because this gives us the extra cooldown, meaning we can use it more. A lot of people use Frost Wall for damage. It is pretty good for damage, but I prefer to use it as a way to wall off enemies to start with, or just generally use it in a defensive manner. And then on bosses, you can use it as an offensive tool. You can use, what I do is I use Frostball, and then I cast Comet over the top of it, and then you engage with Lightning Warp. And honestly, that just destroys everything anyway. So being able to cast this faster is absolutely better for us. And then on top of that, we've still got Icicles, so that the Ice Crystals have less life, so that they do die and do damage more often. And Font of Mana, because this is just super handy for giving us extra mana generation whilst in a fight. And that helps keep us alive, since that's our main source of defense. Okay, so on to the equipment. There's been a number of changes here. I pretty much rebuilt my entire character because I got into the higher maps, such as tier 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, but I kept running into some problems. I was either taking too much burst damage from elemental damage, or I was getting perma-stunned, or perma-frozen, or something else like this. So I ended up having to go back to the drawing board and figure out what to do to be able to fix these. So first and foremost, it's worth mentioning that we are now using a unique ring called the Call of the Brotherhood. This is really, really, and I cannot emphasize how really good this is for the build. This is quite expensive. I spent 15 Exalted Orbs on this, so they may well be more expensive now because they're quite popular. But what this does for us is it converts 100% of our lightning damage straight up into cold damage. It gives us extra freeze build up, extra mana regeneration, extra mana from intelligence, and it gives us a whole bucket load of lightning resistance. But it's particularly that lightning damage conversion that's very important here. The reason this is important is because this converts our lightning warp damage into cold, which means when you're going around telestomping all over your enemies, you're now hitting them with cold damage. And because you're hitting them with cold damage, that can innately freeze them, which means as you jump onto the lightning balls generated up front, you will then end up generating even more lightning balls from hitting enemies because you're freezing them with lightning warp as well. Before, you would not have frozen them with lightning warp because it was lightning damage, which means it would have innately shocked it. So this means you can end up telestomping far more. And if you're in a big group, such as a breach, for example, this build excels extremely well at breach once you get going, because once you start telestomping in a breach group of enemies, you pretty much just keep going. There's so many balls being generated from your lightning warp going around freezing enemies anyway, that you can just keep telestomping until everything's dead. It's fantastic. So you will want one of these. It isn't required for the build to work. You can play in the mid-game, the early to mid-game, end-game setup, which does not use this ring in the build planner. But once you get this ring, you can start considering moving on to the more end-game side of mapping. Next, it's worth mentioning, I was before using the Midnight Braid belt. Now that belt is absolutely required for this build all the way up until the very end game. because that mana damage reduction recoup, which you get from it, pretty much is how you stay alive until you get to about, I would say you're going to need about 2,500 to 3,000 mana. Until you've got that much mana, you will want to use a Midnight Braid. I'm not sure how expensive they are right now, but last I looked, they were about 6 to 8 Exalted Orbs. They are very good, but the only problem with those is that they just don't have anything on it like Stun Threshold or the stronger resistances such as Chaos. And more importantly, they don't come with the Charm effect durations, and we'll get into why those are important a bit later when we talk about Stuns and Freeze. And it also doesn't give you as much mana as you could get, which means you don't get all of the mana stacking benefits. So once you do get 2,500 to 3,000 mana, you can start to look for a yellow rare belt such as mine. You want as much mana as possible. You want chaos resistance on here. You definitely want a bucket load of stun threshold on here. And any resistance is required. And if you can get anything charm related, such as effect durations or charm charges speed up or anything like that, that will be very, very useful to you as well. Especially if you can get charm slots too as well, although those are ridiculously expensive. So I would absolutely prioritize mana, chaos resistance, any elemental resistance you need, and as much stun threshold as you can get, because this will help you in the higher maps whilst you're working towards the absolute GG gear. Moving on to that, really the rest of my rebuild was trying to max out resistances. Now that, if we look at my resistances right now, I have got 75, 72, 68 and 75, and this is on a map 11, I think. So this is the final reduction of resistances you would get. It might be the one before. This is not actually a problem because there is a patch coming out in about a day or two, and the reduction in resistances as we go through the maps is just being taken away. So my resistances here will straight up go all the way above. So I will be over resistanced afterwards. So what I've got here is more than you would need to be able to solve resistances once the next patch comes out this week. So really on armor, I have just rebuilt, so I've got as much resistance as possible with chaos resistance anywhere I could get it. I cannot emphasize how strong chaos resistance is, especially until this patch comes out. They've already said chaos resistance is scaling too hard on the damage, so you will want this because you just get destroyed by anything chaos damage related otherwise. As much maximum mana as possible, and then resistances. That's pretty much the mantra here. If you're lucky enough to get mana per enemy killed here, that's really nice for this build. So you'll see here I've got cold resistance, chaos resistance. On the chest piece I've got fire and lightning. Every single piece has got resistance runes in, which I won't need after the update, but I can't remove them, so I'm going to have to find a new piece of gear. On the helm, you've got fire and lightning resistance. On the boots, I've got chaos resistance here. Yeah, so as the belt we got earlier, we got cold and chaos resistance. So all of this just works together to bring us up to our cap here. Beyond that, we've pretty much got the same stuff as before. We've got spirit on the chest piece, stun threshold anywhere we can get it, such as chest piece and boots, I believe. And then on the helm, you're just trying to stack intelligence and life. And the focus is pretty much the same as before. I'm playing around with stacking crit chance here. So I've got critical hit chance here now, and a bucket load of mana generation as well, and as much energy shield as possible. In an ideal world, I think I would remove one of the energy shield mods and get all spell skills on here instead. Additive damage could also be potentially very nice, but you stack a lot of additive damage everywhere on the build, so the return on that will be diminishing. Critical hit chance will be better, because that works towards another damage multiplier, and having the all spell skills is probably going to be better than the additive damage, but without having the items to test it, it's pretty hard for me to tell exactly which one mathematically is better. But this item here is pretty decent. If you can get anything close to this, that's very good. Weapon-wise, it's the same as what I had before, just better. As much mana as possible, as much cold spell skills as possible, or all spell skills would actually be better here, because that even though you converted your lightning warp damage to cold, that does not make it a cold spell. But getting an all spell skills weapon with anything like these stats is near impossible. So if cold spells is all you can get, then that's fine for now, since most of your big target damage is going to be from Comet or Eye of Winter anyway, which are cold spells. Mana regeneration, cast speed, and if you can get any gains extra damage as extra type of damage, that's really good as well. I've got fire damage here. The best would be cold damage, but any of them will give you a huge spike in damage, so make sure you get those. Amulet-wise, this is just an extremely good amulet I've got. This is going to be basically impossible for me to replace. I would really, really want spirits on this so that I could get more stuff in my spirit reservation, but getting the max mana, the percent max mana, and resistances along with spirit is going to be very hard. Maybe after the patch that will be slightly easier because I won't need all the resistances here. But yeah, you just want to stack as much mana on the amulet as possible. If you can get spirit with it as well while solving resistances, then fantastic. The other ring, this isn't particularly great, but I just got this because I wanted cast speed and chaos resistance. You want as much cast speed as possible, and you want the chaos resistance so you can solve that. The rest of the stats on here, other than max mana, are useless to me. So I could absolutely upgrade this ring. And beyond that, there's one other thing in the itemization which I really struggled with for a while and I had to rebuild around, and that's being permanently frozen or permanently stunned. This is a problem that a lot of builds have had. I know a lot of people have had this, and there's a few different ways you can solve it. The biggest way to solve this on Sorceress is to use Energy Shield and to convert your stun threshold and freeze threshold based on your Energy Shield. This build does not use Energy Shield, so that makes that very, very difficult to do because you can't use that. So what I've done is on the boots, you can get reduced freeze duration. This, you can get up to 60%. I've got a 54%. This means I do get frozen, but when I do get frozen, it isn't for very long. It doesn't solve the problem if you're getting hit by very, very high-hitting freeze skeletons, and lots of them all at once, because they can just chain freeze you. I'm hoping with the coming changes where you cannot chain freeze enemies anymore, that they won't be able to chain freeze you as well. We'll see. But this does help a lot regardless. The stun threshold here on the boots, the belt, and the chest piece gives you enough stun threshold so you're not just getting permanently stunned and interrupted by absolutely everything. This does not permanently solve the problem, but that in conjunction with the stun charm, with the extra charm effect durations here, does, for the most part, solve the stun problem, unless you get completely body blocks in, which we all know is a problem, but you just got to try and avoid this. So I would recommend that setup for now. This will get you into the higher maps, and it will feel a lot better than what it did before. Coming on to the passive tree, guys, I've made a few adjustments here, and again, I'm still playing around with it, but this is where I've got to so far, and it works much, much better. So coming from the start, we are coming up to raw power still. We're still taking open mind here. We're still coming up for Path of Winter. We're still taking Mana Blessing down here. And then we're coming straight up and taking these 3 cold nodes up here: Inescapable Cold, Endless Blizzard, and Glaciation. I still haven't taken Chill to the Bone because we just don't need that extra chill right now, but maybe that would be useful but later on. But right now we've got so much freeze capability that the chill isn't necessarily that important. I have taken this cluster here with Arcane Blossom. This is the one and only cluster in the entire tree that I've found that has mana recovery rate on it. This is particularly important because it scales any mana recovery you've got regardless, whether that's mana generation from your flasks or from damage taken recouped as mana. Now, if you're not using the Midnight Braid belt anymore, you won't benefit from that end of it so much anymore. But we are still getting some damage taken recouped as mana, and this scales all of that as well as everything else. So this is actually very good. It also gives you 30% increased mana regeneration, and we want as much of that as we possibly can. After this, we are still coming over here and grabbing all of the mana generation and the Arcane Intensity node, along with Eldritch Battery, so we convert all of our energy shield into mana. We're also grabbing all 3 of these intelligence nodes because these both give you +8 and this is +25. That just gives you a bucket load of mana, which is great for the build. We're coming down here and grabbing the reduced projectile spell skills side of the cluster here. This really does improve Frostbolts a lot, just the damage output and the utility use of it. Without this, it's just the balls move so fast, it's pretty hard to sort of get them to work well. And also on the ball lightnings, this just makes it easier for you to sort of wait for the ball lightnings to get to where you want them before you jump on them. So I would highly recommend taking these. Maybe later on with skill gems and stuff, you won't need this so much, but I found this to be very useful. And you get a bit of extra damage along with it as well, which is quite nice. We come down, we take Energize here because this just helps us generate more ball lightnings. I'm currently not taking Invocated Efficiency. I've played around with this. And theoretically, the 3% mana when you invocate Ball Lightnings is very nice. The problem is we don't really want to waste 2 nodes to get there. And this, we don't care about the damage of Ball Lightning. That does not do much damage for us. That is purely for utility, so we can Lightning Warp onto it. So that's why I haven't taken it right now. But we'll see when I get to level 100 how I get on. We come down, we take Heavy Frost, we take Thin Ice, and we take Harsh Winter. These all just work really well with our cold skills. This won't affect our Lightning Warp skill. The Heavy Frost here is absolutely crazy for this build. It means the second you freeze an enemy, you just ignore the resistances. And also Thin Ice as well, just doing loads more damage against Thin Ice, regardless of what damage it is. And they both help you build up the freeze. So that's just super nice. This will just help you. These will just help you with your Comet casting, which you do need a bucket load of cast speed to be able to get it into a good state. I've also taken 2 extra clusters here, which weren't in the previous variation. So I'm currently trying to stack crit. This is one of the best nodes in the entire tree for getting a bucket load of crit chance on. So you get 70% here, but at the detriment of 20% damage bonus from criticals. It's better that we crit more often than it is to crit harder. And the reason I say that is because there's some other support nodes we can get which are all about critting recently, which is within the next 4 seconds. So we want to be able to crit regularly enough so that we activate those. So this is pretty good for that. This cluster down here is very, very useful. Have you ever run into those rare enemies that have constant health regeneration that you just find really annoying to kill because they generate health faster and you can damage them? This node here will help you. So here we get 3 nodes that increase the duration of our curses. This is just useful anyway for both of our curses we use, since we use 2 in this build. The Fated End here also increases the duration, but it means any enemies cursed by us have 50% reduced life regeneration, and they cannot regenerate energy shield whilst they're still cursed. So this will solve the energy shield regeneration enemies, and it will slow down their life regeneration enough so that you can hurt them and keep hurting them without having to pump out continuous DPS, which makes it easier for you to move around if you're against a particularly hard enemy that's placing down very annoying modifiers everywhere. So I would highly recommend this. This has made the build much more fluid to play. With the curse thing in mind, we are still using Whispers of Doom. This allows us to use 2 curses. Without this, you can only use 1, so this is absolutely goated. We need this, and we bypass the double activation delay completely on both activation methods, so we don't worry about this. Moving on, I am now working on into the cluster with Overexposure and Stormbreaker. I'm currently testing out Stormbreaker because we are activating on here Chill, Freeze, and Shock all the time. I might try and work in Ignite and Electrocute at some point, which would further benefit this, but that just gives us extra damage. We might not need this one later on, but we will absolutely want to take Overexposure later on once we've got the Ascendancy points and we're applying applying exposure much more. So this is just very nice with a bunch of elemental damage and extra exposure effect to go with it. We work all the way over here to take Adverse Growth. Again, we just want that damage taken recoups as mana. I tried playing without it, but it does just feel a bit better having this in there. It just boosts your mana generation even higher. I mean, once you get to 500-600 mana generation per second, you could potentially take this off. I'm currently at about 500 without it when I'm moving, and it still felt better to have this on. Afterwards, we are still taking Mind over Matter because this makes all of our damage get taken from mana before life, so this is very useful. And then after that, all I've taken is I'm taking All Natural, Breaking Point, and Storm Charged here. I'm just finding these with the critical chance stacking to be very useful. This one here helps us cap our resistances, plus a bunch of elemental damage. We get more elemental damage here, so it scales all of our damage. Here, we're just scaling our shock damage, which later on will be very good when we can double dip with double shock application, and it increases the duration of them, so freeze will last for longer. And then we take all 3 of these for extra damage penetration, which stacking up over here with glaciation means we've got 30% cold penetration without the need for any gems. That's generally enough for any skill to be able to damage enemies with resistance still before you get into the frozen tech. And Storm Charge here, as long as you're critical striking recently, you get an extra 40% damage, and it gives you more crit chance, so that's very nice. In terms of what we could take next, there's a few different things we could take. We've got crit chance nodes up here, such as extra crit chance for spells and more cast speed when you crit. We've got a node down here, which is more cast speed when you crit as well, so that plus this node over here would give you something like, I think it's like 24, 25% cast speed. You could, if you need more cast speed and you're critting a lot, those two clusters work quite well. We're going to come over here and grab this curse cluster over here, zone of control, eventually, because we want the extra area effect for our enfeeble, and this means that all the enemies will be hindered as well, so that's just another ailment that reducing their speed, so that's just another defensive mechanic. We could come over here for the Echoing Frost and Echoing Thunder, and we could actually come down here onto Alternating Current as well. You get a whole bucket load of mana generation, and this would give you another 50% magnitude of shock. So I think once you do the double shock tech, this will be very, very good. There's a whole bucket load of other crit chance nodes you can take here as well for crit chance and crit damage and such. But for now, I would probably focus on those, and those will be reflected in the planner. In terms of what Ascendancies to take, we're still taking down here the Arcane Surge, Constant Gale, and the Force of Will, because these are just very good for this build. More mana generation and cast speed, we need both of these. In terms of your third set and your fourth set of Ascension points, once you can get these, the ones I want to try, and I'm pretty sure will be very good for this build, Strike Twice. Being able to apply 2 of your shocks at the same time, but at the detriment of 50% shock duration. We don't care about the lack of shock duration, because we're going to be able to apply shocks constantly with shocked ground everywhere. And having 2 of these means you get 2 separate damage multipliers, which is what shock does. And because we're going to have about 150% plus magnitude increase here, each shock is going to give us a 50% damage multiplier, so that's pretty enormous. On top of that, we do not want Heart of Storm. We don't use Energy Shield. You could take Heavy Stones for chills, but as we said earlier, maybe that's not necessary. I mean, this might just end up being crazy for making them super slow around you for defensive. But I think overall, Scouring Winds is probably where I'd want to go here. Exposure giving us an extra 20% additional resistance downgrade on the enemies just is another damage multiplier here. We can solve defenses in the build outside of here, so we want to use this to our advantage for damage where possible. In terms of the Elemental Storm, when I tried this out when leveling up, it didn't feel that amazing, to be honest. I haven't tried it with Rain Dancer, so I don't know how often it would cast, but it's not that big, and it didn't seem to do that much damage. So I think overall, Strike Twice and Scouring Winds will be the choice here. In terms of gameplay rotation, I tend to put Frostwall down in front of the enemies, fire Frostbolts and a Comet over the top, which lands on the enemies and causes them to freeze. This will generally then generate a load of ball lightnings that you can then jump over the ice wall onto and telestomp all over the enemies. And if this doesn't kill everything, you can just rinse and repeat that technique, place down your Frost Bomb and Hypothermia for extra multipliers, and then if there's a rare or a harder single target in there, you can focus on damaging him with Eye of Winter or Comet. In terms of boss rotation, as you can see here, I'm fighting Candlemass. I start by activating him and start firing out Frostbolts. This allows me to just create a whole load of chilled ground, so the second he's up, we're freezing him. The second he's frozen, I'm trying to jump on him and activate Shock Ground. We place a load of Comets down with Hypothermia and Frostbolts and Frostbomb all over him. So we're just trying to debuff him with as many ailments as possible while he's frozen. And then once we hit him, he takes a whole bunch of damage. You'll also notice during this fight, I probably fire a few Eye of Winters as well. And those do a lot of damage. I think I was testing out in this fight which one was better. It does generally seem like Eye of Winter is better, as you can see the numbers racking up in the tens to 50,000s, maybe even hundreds of thousands. But the combination of one Comet and then spamming Eye of Winter tends to be a very good combination here once he's frozen. So I'd recommend trying these out and seeing which one takes your fancy. And as you can see, we pretty much just destroyed Candlemass here, and I believe this was a tier 11 map at the time. So it's not quite tier 15, but he went down with relative ease. So that's where I've managed to take the build so far, guys, and this will absolutely get you to tier 15 maps once leveled and geared enough. I'm still working on an absolute final version that you can tackle the Pinnacle boss with. As mentioned before, be sure to check out the build planner in the description below, and if you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment on the video, or check me out live on Twitch, and be sure to follow the channel if you want to see future content. Until next time, guys, keep safe, and much love.